A man fumbles with a stack of books next to his car. Because his arm is in a heavy plaster cast, he struggles to collect them as they slide toward the pavement. To any passing stranger, he looks like someone who simply needs a hand. That man was Theodore Robert Bundy. He was well-spoken, educated, and spent his spare time at a suicide prevention hotline, an outward identity that made the reality of his crimes nearly impossible for the public to reconcile. From 1974 to 1978, he left a trail across 7 states. He targeted young women in Washington, Utah, and Colorado before eventually fleeing to Florida, staying ahead of authorities who were only beginning to realize they were hunting the same man. Bundy didn't succeed by hiding in the shadows. He succeeded because he knew exactly how to blend into the light, using social norms of helpfulness to turn a stranger's kindness into a fatal vulnerability. To understand how he maintained that light-filled exterior, we have to look at the environment that first shaped his perception of the truth. Bundy was raised within a fundamental deception. For years, he was led to believe that his biological mother was his sister and that his grandparents were actually his parents. His childhood was defined by this instability, marked by his mother's financial struggles and a grandfather described by some as a violent, abusive alcoholic. These early feelings of inadequacy necessitated the creation of what psychologists call a mask of sanity. He developed a fabricated, charismatic persona, a version of himself that was smarter and more respectable than the reality he felt inside. While this childhood displacement didn't create a killer, it established a pattern for living within a lie. He grew up in a world where the most basic facts of his identity were negotiable, a foundation that made his future double life possible. As he continued to kill, his methods became more calculated. He moved away from residential break-ins and toward public lures that required a high level of planning and emotional compartmentalization. He purposefully avoided firearms, which created noise and ballistic evidence. Instead, he carried a metal crowbar, a silent, blunt instrument that allowed him to maintain control without drawing attention. After the murders, he frequently revisited dump sites like Taylor Mountain. He would return to the bodies for days at a time, engaging in necrophilia and grooming the corpses long after the initial attack. These behaviors led analysts to classify him as a psychopathic sexual predator, driven by a combination of narcissism and sexual sadism. The fact that he returned to these sites shows that the act of murder was only one part of his ritual. The core of his fantasy wasn't just violence. It was the total domination and absolute possession of his victims. In the 1970s, law enforcement was at a significant disadvantage. There was no centralized database for violent crime, and DNA testing was still years away from being a courtroom reality. Investigators began to bridge the gap with trace evidence. Inside Bundy's van, they found microscopic fibers that matched the clothing of Kimberly Leach, a 12-year-old girl who had been abducted in Florida. But the final, definitive link came from the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, where a distinct double bite mark was discovered on the body of victim Lisa Levy. This turned the case toward forensic odontology. Experts used scaled photographs to turn the bruising into a physical map, a technique that was entering a Florida courtroom for the first time. After his arrest in Pensacola, authorities obtained a court order for dental impressions of Bundy's teeth, looking for specific irregularities. His teeth were highly distinctive, featuring unique chips and misaligned spacing. When the forensic experts compared those impressions to the marks on the victim, the result was a direct match. Because his psychological mask was so impenetrable, it ultimately took microscopic fibers and the unique structure of his own bone to strip away his anonymity and prove his guilt in court. The 1979 Florida trial became a watershed moment for the American legal system. It was the first time cameras were allowed to broadcast a murder trial, turning the proceedings into a national event. Bundy chose to act as his own lawyer. He ignored the advice of his legal team, using the platform to try and outsmart the prosecution and feed his own narcissistic need for attention. The entire trial became a psychological spectacle. He personally cross-examined the survivors of his own attacks, forcing the women he failed to kill to face him across the courtroom. He winked at the cameras and smiled at the judge, maintaining the charming, wised-up attitude he had carried through his entire spree. The trial wasn't a search for justice for Bundy. It was his final, desperate attempt to maintain absolute control over his own narrative on a national stage. Even after his execution in 1989, huge gaps remained in his timeline. While he confessed to 30 murders, the true total of his victims remains a mystery. His ability to evade capture for so long forced law enforcement to evolve. The FBI conducted extensive death row interviews with Bundy, using his psychological profile to help develop the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Today, the forensic techniques used to convict him are viewed with more skepticism. Bite mark analysis remains a highly contested discipline in modern courts. But his case permanently changed how we view killers. He proved that intelligence and charm do not negate psychopathy, and that a killer doesn't always look like an outcast. In an era of carefully curated social identities and digital deception, Bundy's legacy is the proof that the most dangerous predators are often the ones hiding